Good morning, everyone. We'll just get started in a few minutes.
You can also rename yourself if you like. You all seem pretty good. Zulema, you could rename yourself.
I like being Impact Alpha.
Okay.
Great. All right, well, shall we? All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Agents of Impact call number 23, Changing the Racial Algorithm. I am Zulema Beeble, Director of Operations of Impact Alpha, and we thank you for taking the time to be here with us today and for being an Impact Alpha subscriber. The call is one of the many benefits of your subscription, and don't forget to check out impactalpha.com for the latest news and also to listen to our latest podcast. Before we get started, let me just go over the rundown of the call. Monique will kick us off and introduce our guest today. This will be followed by a conversation between the panelists, and we will spend the last 15 minutes of the call on questions for the audience. We have the chat feature available here, so please feel free to use that to ask questions, add resources, and make any comments. We'll collect the questions and try to get to them at the end of the call. At the top of the hour, we will close the official call, and we will stay on for another 15 minutes. So if you have time, please do hang out with us. We call it the after show or the happy hour, so you can take a break and come back and join us. Lastly, the call is being recorded and it will be available early next week, so make sure you look out for that on your daily brief. And with that, I'll send it over to you, Monique.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining this call. I'm just going to welcome our guests quickly and then set up a few opening comments that we can begin to react to. And so I am happy to be joined by David Beeck, who is, of course, Editor-in-Chief of Impact Alpha. Hello, David.
Hi, Monique. Thanks for taking the hosting reins.
And I will pass the mic to him in a few more moments for some other framing comments. But we'll first go quickly to introduce our other speakers for this call. We've got Ryan Bowers from Activest Frontline Solutions. Hello, Ryan. Welcome.
Thanks, Monique.
We've got Marla Blow from Mastercard.
Hi, everybody.
Hello. And we have Erika Davies, a fellow at the Beeck Center at Georgetown University.
Hello.
And we have Daryn Dodson, Illumen Capital.
Hi, everyone.
He gave a nice wave. And last but not least, we are also joined by Andrea Armeni from Transform Finance.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Monique.
Hi, great. So with that, let's get started. So I'm sure everyone has seen by now that iconic protest sign that is now a t-shirt and a mug. Racism is so American that when we protest racism, it's assumed we're protesting America. But I think that sums it up, because the point is that racism is a feature of the American economy and our history. It's not a bug. So it's embedded in the design phase of America, capitalism, finance, all of our activities. And so when we think about that and we start to address what do we do now with this, we think about where can we take action on the policy and national level, but also at the tactical level in the domains that which we work. So to address the system, certainly act number one is to vote, to engage in our democracy, but there is a limit to that, how that informs our daily activities. So we have to do both. So we need to not, of course, absolve our activities saying, well, it's not the national federal policy level, so therefore hand-wringing, therefore we do nothing, and lead to potentially inaction, which I'm sure some of you know people who that does stop them in their tracks from doing anything further about the ways that which racism shows up in our everyday lives. So in order to do that, I just want to honor Hispanic Heritage Month for a moment and think about the words of Dolores Huerta. If people don't vote, everything stays the same. You can protest until the sky turns yellow or the moon turns blue, and it's not going to change anything if you don't vote. If we extend that further, what's going to change in finance and impact investing if we don't take action? What are the policies, procedures, norms that we need to interrogate in order to pursue an anti-racist agenda, if that is our goal, and change the way that we work? So with that, I just want to share a little bit about this piece that David and I have been reflecting on, the Centering Blackness, the Path to Economic Liberation for All. I'm going to post it here in the chat for those who haven't seen it. It's written by Anne Price, and it's really resonated with me in a number of different dimensions. And so the analog for me here is that anti-racism is a prism. All of the history of America and everything are based in this notion of racism and the racist acts towards Black and Indigenous people and others. And if we center Blackness as a prism and out refracts all the different domains and places where we work, then doing so allows us to focus our intention on anti-racism and center solutions and our actions and activities around thinking about Blackness and Indigenous people and other people of color in our solution sets and all the different levels where that appears. That is the way that I have come to sort of frame this conversation in my head. Hope that was helpful to some others. But David, you know, you and I have been talking about this piece for some time. Can you share a little bit about Impact Alpha's role in this conversation and why you thought it'd be important to bring these voices together today, and also thinking a little bit about, you know, what are we doing here as a community of impact investing practitioners?
Well, thank you so much, Monique. Yeah, that piece really had a big impact on me. One of the things that it says is that it's incumbent to think about proactively about what this new anti-racist, Blackness-centered system, economic system arrangements might be. So in a sense, that's, I think, the challenge that we're trying to take up today. And in kind of the context of Impact Alpha, these calls, if you think about them, a bunch of folks I know on this call I see have been, you know, are sort of regulars now. And you can see that there's kind of a conversation developing that we've been trying to, you know, just nurture along, that goes from, you know, the last call was systemic racism and systemic risk. And it was connecting the conversations around the changes that have to happen broadly in the economic and financial system. Some people talk about ESG, some people talk about reimagining capitalism or resetting capitalism. And that you have to make sure, as you said, center Blackness in that discussion so that that new system that emerges out of that whole discussion does not recreate or replicate the racism that's, as you said, and I agree, at the core of the current system. So we both have to root it out and then think about how to sort of reprogram or recode. We've talked about algorithm. I think some people talk about operating system. Some people talk about DNA. But what we are saying is that what would it look like to actually build this new system in a way that centers Blackness? What I love about that piece too is centering Blackness is a positive framing. Anti-racism is important, but it's a negative framing. It puts you in the frame of mind of that. So anyway, what I hope we can come out of this call with is both an understanding of the particular ways, and Andrea is going to help us with this, the particular ways that racism does show up in portfolios and in investment decisions of all sorts and sectors and business models and term sheets of investment deals. And then also, what are the tools, strategies, products that are the embryonic and early forms of this new system. So thank you.
So I think we'll begin with the interrogation, essentially, that Andrea and team worked in collaboration with a number of partners. And Andrea, could you share with us a little bit more about that work and what you aimed to do and some of your findings?
Yeah, happy to do so. And thank you for the opportunity. And thanks for everyone to engage in this conversation. I will note that what we put out today is intentionally titled as a discussion briefing, because we think that this has to be an ongoing process, and one that is not just a matter of investors talking among themselves, but really taking the lead from racial justice practitioners and subsuming the work to a broader racial justice agenda. And maybe by way of context, it makes sense to pick up on what you were saying, Monique, about voting and the importance of voting. So please do vote. But as we all know, finance also votes, sometimes more than individuals do, and less democratically so. And that gets us to the point of what is the role of investors? Why are we looking at finance as a locus to drive racial justice? where there are these other avenues of, political action, of protest, of changing the narrative. Well, because frankly, finance touches everything and is such a domineering force in our society, because finance is not democratic, and because as investors, we are part of a class that has benefited to this day from structural and systemic racism, right? There are racist structures that are baked within capital. Regardless of how you look at it, you say, well, actually, we've been on the receiving side of this. If you deem yourselves investors, don't we have a special responsibility to do so, to take action? And can we do that while still being mindful that we are ultimately, tourists, we are mistrusted, we are not the thing that matters here, right? The best we can do is use the capital as a tool to first reduce the level of racial injustice that is baked in so many investments, and then build also racial justice through the allocation, the deployment of capital, the engagement around that capital. So with that as a frame, the work that we've been doing is saying, is an exploration of this question that is still ongoing after 4 years of work. What would it mean to look at every investment from a racial justice angle? And if you think through most of the activity that has happened so far, that has investors as the locus of change, as the agent of change, it has been largely on efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially at the board or top management level, looking at the racial pay gap, funding entrepreneurs of color, first-time fund managers of color, restoring the grossly racialized imbalance around asset managers. And we thought, even if all those things happen, there is a lot of what happens in the world of capital. There is a lot in the, however, 85 trillion this year of assets that are professionally managed, that will still be left untouched. And even though it's untouched, it's still deeply racialized, right? It might not have anything to do with private prisons. It might not have anything to do with CDFIs, but it still is racialized insofar as it has disparate impacts on communities of color. They might be apparent in some cases. They are not obvious on their face in others. So our research has focused on that, on developing an outcomes-based approach to a racial justice lens for investors. So saying, as you're thinking about your allocations, think through all the potential outcomes that are informed by your capital flows. And of course, the answer that one gets to that is like, holy cow, like how do I even start doing that? You're asking for too much. And if you tell me that everything is racialized around investments, I'm going to throw my hands up and I'm going to do nothing, which is precisely where we don't want to go with this. So so we said, well, let's break it down a little bit. Let's think about organizing all the racialized disparate impacts that you see in society in the same way as academics and practitioners, in particular academics of color, have been thinking about this by linking them to issue areas. So thinking in health-related outcomes, there are some components that are deeply racialized, from life expectancy to the availability of hospitals, to the high mortality rate for Black women at birth, right? There are all these things that within the area of health have disparate outcomes by race, within the area of education, within the area of criminal justice, right? And in that way, let's flesh out, tease out all these impacts that you see and tie them to economic activity on which investors play a role. So you could think about the privatization of hospitals, right? So, or the buyout, let's say, by private equity funds of hospitals, many of which get then shut down, the property gets sold, and the people from that community, from a community of color, are left without any medical care. That is the type of impact that we're talking about that is not racialized on its face, right? Private equity buyouts of hospitals are not racialized on their face. You can look through all sorts of impacts of that sort. We wanted to make sure that we're looking at things that are not obvious, but that are material to the community around whom this work is centered. So if you were to say to me, what is one thing that you could do in order to advance race through investments, it would largely be look at quality jobs, because low quality jobs disparately impact people of color, in particular women of color in this country. Municipal finance, a ton of absolutely fascinating issues there, a lot of racialized outcomes that our friend Ryan Bowers from Activest will talk about in a moment. So once you have all this, just to wrap it, because I want to just give this quick overview, once you have seen all the different impacts that there are and you've tied them to some sort of economic activity, then you can say, okay, as an investor, does that show up somewhere in my portfolio? Is it in my public equities? Is it in my private equity? If somebody comes to me and says, hey, we have this amazing distressed debt fund that we want to pitch to you, great, 2020 post-COVID opportunity, you could say, well, actually, let me look at this category around housing. No, it has disparate impacts on communities of color when you do this kind of special situation, distressed debt operations in real estate. And therefore, if I'm serious about racial justice, I will not engage with that fund, or I will talk to the fund manager as to why there is something deeply messed up because I'm looking at it from a racial justice stance. So I'm happy to bring up more examples of that afterwards, and thinking about how we can link that type of analysis then to action, right? Who can do what? As a family office, what can you do? As a pension fund, as a fund manager, and what can you do in each asset class? Clearly, public equities lend themselves to some things, private equity certainly to others, and as again, I imagine Ryan will cover the whole muni space that has been deeply underexplored in the context of impact. Can really be primed for a racial justice approach.
And before we bring in Ryan, and I will bring him in a second, Andrea, if you could just distill for us your, I think, highest level takeaway from these years of study that you've undergone. Is there a central kernel of truth that you have essentially assessed as a result of these studies, or is there an emotional core to the work that you would like to share with us in terms of, if we take nothing from the larger article that you've done, what is the most important thing for us to absorb from this?
Well, the emotional core, if we want to get emotional, is that this is going to be really, really hard work, because it requires a very deep analysis by sector. It requires the reckoning by investors of how they have been on the white investors. They're probably still the majority. They have been on the winning end of equations that involve extraction of wealth from people of color and from the land of communities of color. And that is going to be hard, but you got to bite the bullets. Now is the time to do this. People have been talking about this for a long time, and regardless of how far investors want to go, there's a little bit of a groundswell now that we can step into. But that will require the nugget to take away from this a much deeper analysis than saying, oh, look, I'm not being overtly racist in my investment, yay. It requires saying, no, how am I really impacting communities of color in a way that makes me money, but leaves them in a worse position than they were in before I intervened with my capital?
Ryan, you've done that kind of deep dive, in particular in municipal finance and cities, and just what have you found? I mean, to Andrea's point, it shows up in so many different ways. Racism shows up. I mean, what are you finding as you dig into sort of literally budgets and bonds?
We're to the original point that this is the original algorithm of how, I think, Monique, you had said this was kind of embedded in our system, and it's almost our financial system and our municipalities wouldn't exist without it. Not only the original design, original embedding, but even their kind of ongoing operation requires, Black lives and brown bodies and, indigenous lands. And so this, original factors of production, land, labor, capital, that was, municipalities are kind of entities of the state. They're creatures of the state. They're given, we saw this in sanctuary cities, a lot of the fights around them, that states were literally invoking, we will remove your municipal charter as a city and either force you to dissolve or combine with another entity, pool your funding because we created you. So a lot of it goes back to kind of core powers of local governments and states, how they exist, why they were created. But part of our work at Activest, we kind of look at kind of municipal finance through a lens we call fiscal justice, is really looking at the kind of equity in budgets and really the based on the belief that cities that treat their residents fair have better long-term fiscal outcomes. And so we look through everything from income statements to balance sheets. And part of our work is we kind of go into cities, and as we're looking through budgets, really kind of writing down or kind of grossing up or really restating financial statements based on some undisclosed risk, uncompensated risk, or off balance sheet extra financial risks that we see that that are kind of evident for people that have eyes to see, or maybe that are aware of the research, aware of a lot of the issues that Andrea's research lifted up that are these, as you find out, municipal budgets last a year. Credit ratings are good for, a year or two generally. But, we're talking about municipal issues like public health and housing, that these are 20, 30-year issues. Interestingly, the same kind of lifetime of a, municipal bond typically. So we're encouraging investors to look at these issues and factor them in over these longer time horizons, not just these shorter kind of almost political cycles.
Ryan, you mentioned writing down writing down the assets, and you have a great piece. I think Dennis put the link in the chat. Racism stranded assets. It's almost there's an analogy we've been talking about to sort of climate. Fossil fuel stranded assets also being written down, by the way. Also, a long legacy and a long history, obviously, and the economy, that we live in, kind of grew up around it, but now increasingly seen as archaic or something to be rooted out, changed, transformed. Just what are the sort of stranded racist assets?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, physical assets, we talk about the value of, new police stations and prisons as this kind of, these remnants of this incarceral state that we're moving away from, that we know it's almost like a unmitigated, brownfield, a city that'll have. It's literally creating liabilities every year. The same thing with police departments. These are practices and tools that are sheriffs in the South, where their job was to originally, after slavery, to round up black folks, force them into convict labor and convict leasing as one of these three factors of production to really power the Southern economy, whether you're talking about timber or agriculture or mining. And so, we really see this apparatus that really values property over people as really these outdated things. So, a lot of that is part of the kind of criminal justice apparatus. But, I think we're also going to see that unfortunately, we're seeing it in public education. I used to work in the education team in the mayor's office in Philadelphia. And we saw this hollowing out of public schools. It was amazing. So, but budgets are tight in a city. You need to, maybe you have a declining population, you cut school budgets, you close schools. And then there was this amazing initiative to actually resell school buildings. And now there's I think it's called Beeck High School in South Philly, is a beer garden. It's a really cool beer garden. You can go and you can drink on the roof and be cool and young and hip. But it's like on the property that, used to serve neighborhood schools. And so now charter schools are kind of, there's like a meat market to buy up these old kind of husks of public education, this remnant. Someday I'll tell my kids, oh my God, this used to be public schools. There's this thing called public ed that maybe you don't remember when you were little, but it's this very real thing that is, these assets that are now, up for grabs for a fraction of their kind of cost.
And speaking of very real, you also did some work on related to criminal justice in Kenosha. Can you talk quickly about that before we go to Marla?
Yeah. So this is this. I was going to talk too much about it because it's something that we're working on. So don't write anything about this. But so
off the record with 240 people here.
Yeah, this is off the
Every
record.
closest
Are y'all?
friends.
Can I have everyone's
Yeah, we
commitment to not say anything?
won't
Thank
say
you.
anything.
Thank you.
Just type NDA in the chat. Everyone has effectively signed it.
Wait, does it actually make it worse when you say something's off the record? Then
Yeah,
like, "Ooh,
because
that means-"
everybody wants to
Okay.
hear it. So
Now
go
you pay
ahead.
attention. So I
Man,
think
I
you
am
just got
I am
everyone's
such
interest.
such an amateur. Okay, sorry, y'all. So yeah, so one of the things we noticed, there's been a lot of Black folks killed on camera recently in the past few years, and a lot of those, where you're talking about Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, and others. It was a kind of a byproduct of police pulling folks over for minor traffic infractions a lot of times, and it's you can almost make this connection between policing and police revenues to sustain themselves, and also leading to kind of violent and deadly interactions with folks of color. And we're seeing also this other connection too between civil unrest and police misconduct and police violence. So in Kenosha, one of the issues that we look a lot at, and also from our colleagues at Good Jobs First, I've seen a lot of their work, is that Wisconsin has a addiction to tax abatements and TIF districts. I'm not from Chicago, but my Chicago people tells me Illinois, and Chicago in particular, has a hell of a lot of TIF districts. Well, one of the things in Wisconsin is, there's a practice of having TIF districts. Some of these go back into the 1970s. In Kenosha in 2016, they had about 29% of their general fund revenue went to TIF districts, to abatements. They're kind of giving that money away essentially. And this is, tax abatements, corporate tax incentives are one of the most kind of expensive, redundant, and kind of politically fraught ways of doing economic development. Well, and one of the things that you find in Kenosha is that in 2017, I think their city was kind of voting on whether they should use body cams or not. And there was an agreement that they wanted to buy body cams, but part of the issue was they didn't have the money to do it. This is one of these excuses that could be easy. This is the right thing to do. We don't have the funding. But as Kenosha was giving away 29% of their revenue, that could have bought body cams several times over. So really, this conversation about, can we afford it? Is it expedient? This is one of these issues where you kind of kick the can down the road. But in hindsight, not that it would have prevented his shooting, but at the same time, it's one of these things that could have made a difference. Maybe it would have made police act differently. It's one of I think a terrible example that we also talk about in New Jersey. State of New Jersey just passed some reform. Some of our colleagues at the Fines and Fees Justice Center told us about this, that they bring in over $100 million a year in fines and fees from traffic violations. And a lot of this it's a really regressive taxation by citation. Mm-hmm. So New Jersey voted last month to do away with these sources of revenue. But they found that the proceeds from those fines were backing some of their municipal debt. So instead of enacting this change today, the legislature said, we're going to stop this revenue source, but it's going to start 15 years from now.
Wow.
So there's this, this weird kind of temporal issue of when is justice relevant? When is it too late? And is there a time frame on it, an expiration date?
I believe the answer is, when do we want it? Now is the chant. So Marla, you have a city strategy related to Mastercard. So I think that bridges nicely. Can you share with us a little bit about the Mastercard theory of change with your recent announcement and how this fits into the discussion?
Yep, happy to. Thank you, Monique. And Ryan, I think you set up a really important piece of this conversation, which is the ways that this is an underpinning of across the dimensions of finance in our society. So in working with Mastercard, where I'm in the Center for Inclusive Growth, I lead our social impact for North America. We've looked at all of the ways that the financial system has contributed to creating a lot of the inequities that we're facing, and the role that it plays across the board in a whole host of arenas, including, I love that example, that you find out that your municipal bonds are based on the application of a fee structure that is specifically targeted. And so we went through and looked at what we see happening across a whole host of dimensions, from who has access to the banking system, what it costs in order to transact and execute the day-to-day of your life, depending on whether or not you have access to the financial system, what it means to be able to build and fund a business, what it takes, what is asked of those businesses in order to access things like even the PPP program that's been created now in response to the moment that we're in. And all of those, and then of course, there's the entire construct about access to mortgages as one of the biggest contributors to the creation of the racial wealth gap. I think some would argue is the GI Bill, which gave the guarantee to mortgages post World War II. And when Black veterans could not access mortgage financing and could not avail themselves of that benefit, what we created from that point forward was a levered appreciating asset that was only accessible to some part of the population. And the divergence, I don't have to tell a community of people that are investors what it means to have access to a leveraged appreciating asset over lifetimes, right? That can be handed down to your relatives and can become a source of collateral. The implications of that are tremendous, and it contributes directly to getting to a place where we have a 10x racial wealth gap. So Mastercard, in looking at this and looking at you can trace the distrust in the banking system back to the failure of the Freedman Savings Bank, right? And that was based right here in Washington, D.C. And there's a long sordid story around that I won't even tell right now. But I think there's any number of places to look at it. And so we distilled it down to a couple of things. One, inability to access capital for business growth. Two, inability to access opportunity by virtue of unequal education and uneven ability to participate in employment. And then three, underinvested in communities, right? And looking at the economics of place and where people are and what is going on the ground in their local communities. And so those are the three areas that we've chosen to tackle, based on the fact that what Mastercard can do well is be the backbone, right? Like be the underpinning, be the network that connects people to the financial system. And so that's where we are plugging ourselves in. We've identified 7 cities across the country. And we've chosen them based on sort of understanding of where African Americans are concentrated, but also looking at the differences between cities, right? So we've got the big metropolis type cities like Los Angeles and New York, got small cities like Birmingham and Dayton, got 3 cities in between, right? Atlanta, New Orleans, St. Louis. How do you go and work with our partners that actually issue the Mastercard products that we all carry around in our wallets? How do we bring new products to enable people in those cities to access our financial system at a reasonable price point, right? So an example there is in Los Angeles, we partnered up with the city to enable even the homeless residents in that community who don't have a stable address, right? And not having a stable address makes it very difficult for you to participate and access all kinds of financial relief. But Los Angeles is a very prosperous city, lots of engines of growth and dynamism. And it had $36 million that they wanted to distribute to Los Angeles residents. And so Mastercard has a city key program that allowed us that serves as a form of identification, a form of storage or store of value, and allows transactions. And so we use that card to enable the city to distribute $36 million entirely to homeless population in the city of Los Angeles, and did so at effectively no cost, right? That Mastercard bore the cost of that issuance so that the population could benefit, achieve maximum benefit, right, and the value of it could accrue to them. And those are the ways that we enable the distribution, right? We enable the life and livelihood of people in their local communities. I think importantly, in terms of how we think about this, Mastercard is not a money manager. We're not an asset management organization. We don't put capital to work in the ways that people on this call and the panelists think about actively engaging and making direct investments. But what we do think about is how do we have information that might enable investors and enable market participants to make decisions on the basis of what we know is happening on the ground in some of these communities. And so through our network, for example, we can see changes in consumption patterns by very, very granular levels of data. So we can look down to the census tract level, for example, or even down to block by block, really. We can show, for example, in the city of New Orleans, that the livable Claiborne corridor, which is a neighborhood in New Orleans, was experiencing kind of a revitalization, right? We could see that there's opportunity to make investment there and drive the growth in that city. And there's a demonstration of the impact of of how that information enabled capital to flow in this historically Black neighborhood in New Orleans that had been underinvested in. Post-Katrina effectively had been kind of left on its own. But even before that, right, tracing back to the 60s, when a highway got built, which if you want to go across the United States and look at what's happening in cities, trace the highway system, right? The number of places where a highway shows up and gets built in the middle of a neighborhood, overwhelmingly a Black neighborhood, right? Overwhelmingly often it's a Black neighborhood. And on one side of this highway is prosperity, and on the other side is blight, right? And how do you get people to rethink those kinds of trends, to understand the implications of those decisions, and be able to prove that there is spending power, there's viable business to be built, and that is the way that Mastercard inserts itself and adds a voice to this conversation of how to enable the flow of capital to places that might be overlooked. And so that's where we bring some more of our assets to bear. But the last thing I'll say on this is that we do this not with Mastercard showing up at the national level and trying to accomplish this from 50,000 feet, right? We have bank partners in just about every geography across the country. We have partners that we work with on a philanthropic basis. We have issuing fintech partners and marketing partners. We work with the local community development financial institutions. We partner up with investor organizations like this audience and bring together the coalitions and create a network around each one of these cities in a customized, sort of unique fashion that addresses the challenges in a particular city to help bring this to life, right? So our $500 million commitment here over the next 5 years hinges on all of those principles and is informed by that backdrop. So I'll stop there, but happy to chime in whatever else you'd like.
Thank you, Marla. And Erika, I think this actually bridges quite nicely to the work that you're doing at the Beeck Center, and really your work in the diverse manager space and thinking about intersectionality in investing, and a couple other ways that I think your research is looking to other movements to understand what finance should and ought to be doing. So I won't speak for you. I'll let you speak for yourself and can share a little bit reflecting on what you've heard just now.
Sure. So I'll start with the work at the Beeck Center, but weave into that a lot of the things that are common in this work, and what I've learned over time from racial equity and racial justice work in other sectors that are absolutely applicable here as well. But at the Beeck Center, within the Fair Finance portfolio, I am managing the Equitable Access to Capital Markets project, which is looking at moving the needle on assets that are managed by BIPOC and women-owned asset management firms. And we're really looking and focusing actually really on Black, Indigenous, and people of color-owned asset management firms and women of color in terms of that industry. And so when you look at the $70 trillion industry, less than 1.5% of those assets are being managed by those firms. And so I think they represent somewhere close to 8% of asset management firms, but aren't even getting close to that share, never mind representation in the general population. And so it's a dislocation, right? And so the fact that we, one, don't pay as much attention to that as we should, also means that we are missing what comes with having diverse decision-making and a process. And so that entire structure, and when you think about, who's at the table to make decisions, the criteria that are put in place for asset managers to be selected, to even be viewed, right, to determine whether or not their performance is strong, all of that continues to perpetuate and reinforce white male asset management, to the disadvantage of literally anything else, of any other type of asset management firm that has diverse ownership. And we'll hear from Daryn about this, but his work at Illumen Capital and the research that was produced actually then gave us evidence to the ways in which that reinforcement happens and how it feeds bias and how that bias then justifies the decision making. And so it's just this perpetual cycle that if we do not stop and interrogate that algorithm, and I think it's interesting that that's the word that we use for this particular session, in that really an algorithm is a set of guidelines that describes how to perform a task. And so if we don't undo that algorithm, it will keep going the way that it has always gone without any intention or intention around the racism that's embedded in it. And so we're at the point in 2020, although there are bad actors, we don't need bad actors actually to perpetuate systemic racism. We need people to interrogate the systems and the policies and the practices that are in front of us. And then to decide to make the changes to those. And so I'm not going to steal Daryn's thunder, but I think one of the most interesting features of that report was that even when the performance was strong, there was still a bias against Black asset management firms. And so that's where the question around, like, well, what are we really talking about here? What are we really trying to understand and get accomplished here? Because when the performance exists, you're still not choosing a particular type of firm. And so that's where the discomfort starts to come in. And when doing anything that centers race, that is just a part of this work. And that's a lot of the soft skill in doing, or the art of doing work, again, that centers Blackness, that is tackling these thorny issues. Because when you get to the heart of it, race was created. Like, this is a social construct that was developed to perpetuate advantage and disadvantage. And so you had the creation of a system that dehumanized an entire people for profit. And so here we are in 2020, still trying to affirm that Black Lives Matter, because the system basically said they're not human. And so when you're at the intersection of those things, the intersection of like dehumanizing people so that you can achieve profit, when you find out that that's like what's holding this whole thing up, that's a very hard pill for people to swallow. And then to figure out, well, how do we start to undo this with greater intention? And so I think having yes, this is personal work. It is deeply personal work, but it's also looking at the structures, those policies, as we've heard, right? Public policy and institutional policy. Having an understanding of the history that brought us to those conditions is going to be incredibly important, because without that, the recommendations don't make sense to people. And so you do have to have an understanding of that history. Again, whether it's in the context of geography or in the context of an issue or an industry, you do have to bring that into play as well. Everyone has been talking about the use of data, and the ability to disaggregate that data Marla, I'm so fascinated about what you just shared about being able to see actual activity, at a census tract level. Like, that's the level of data that's required, so we really can start to unpack how communities are situated differently, how people are situated differently, and making sure that we're developing targeted strategies to address that. Hearing a lot about, it just has to be race explicit. We can no longer have policy moving forward that's not race informed. because there's no such thing as race neutral policy in this country. So when looking at whether, again, it's public or institutional policy, we've got to take those things into account as well. And so these are some of the things that I know and I've seen working in other spaces that are advancing racial justice and racial equity that are absolutely applicable here. But because finance was always held out as one of those things, oh no, this is all about performance. But that's an even biased view as well, because we're not seeing everyone's performance, and we're not, we've got to think about how we're defining risk, and we've got to think about what it is that we want to see from the outcomes of these different processes and all these layers. And so literally every decision could go through an analysis, like a racial equity impact analysis. And yes, it takes time, but that we didn't get here overnight either. And so we're gonna have to take the time and be intentional, equally intentional about how we start to move to dismantle what is a massive system. And this one is really at the heart of it as well. So with that, I will I will pause and turn it back over to you, Monique.
Erika, I love that racial equity impact analysis, because it gets to something I think that we were talking about the other day, was the systemic, that racism has a history, but it's become a systemic risk. It's now, as you said, right, it's running counter to what people want in terms of more inclusive prosperity, more inclusive economy. It's a drag now. So just talk a little bit about how that reframing from, as racism as a systemic risk for the whole system.
Right. Well, I mean, we're seeing it, we're experiencing it right now in the midst of COVID-19. But we also have experienced it in the past, like when you don't have other perspectives in a decision, when there's like a whole lot of groupthink and that whole groupthink is still going to advantage one particular group. 2008, I think, is a great example of that. Then that's what you get. And so I'd said this once before, that nobody talked about, well, maybe white men aren't the best ones to manage money anymore because of what happened, right, to the economy. Nobody have that conversation, but we always have to have a conversation about the risk of investing in diverse managers, or shifting the way capital flows, or shifting ownership of capital to the communities, Black communities and other communities of color. Like there's somehow a risk in that. Well, those aren't the decisions that have had like global consequences, right? Those aren't the people that have made those decisions. And so by not having more people at the table to mitigate some of the deep damage that happens when we don't do those things, when we leave everything in the hands of a relatively small amount of the population, like that, we know what happens with that risk. We really do. Like it shows up all around us. So what's the risk in trying a different approach that has more people who have more have deeper experience in a different way, but have a deeper experience to the table, either around the decision making itself or the actual ownership of capital as well.
Great. Daryn, I know you're going to have a lot to say, because every time people have been making points, I've been thinking, Daryn told me about that a while back. So the notion that returns are being left on the table. I know there's a moral dimension to this, but there's also a growing recognition, and you're helping drive this with the fund managers you work with, that racism is just a drag on their portfolios, a drag on performance. Just what are you finding, and how are you getting at that?
Thanks for the question, David. Part of what I've been thinking a lot about is an idea that, and I'll certainly get to your question. Halloween's coming up. And a bunch of social psychologists did a study that showed that kids trick-or-treating would go around, and many of you probably remember this moment in your lives, where you get to the neighbor who's out of their house but leaves a big basket of candy right there on their doorstep. And it says, "Take one." There's a little sign that says, "Take one." And the kids go and load up and grab as much candy as they can. At least most of the kids do. But one of the things that the researchers found, and repeated this study in bake sales and offices of adults, is that if you put a mirror next to the bag of candy, compliance goes up by like 70%. And what I wanted to talk about is the black mirror held by all. The Nobel Prize winning economist Robert Schuller says, in the future, we will surely have bigger such bubbles, each built upon a new and different era story. And we will have to invent new names for them. Thus, the black mirror held by all. And part of what I think that is so powerful about being a part of a group debunking the idea that impact investing cannot achieve market rate returns and many other types of returns, but at least that's part of the massive argument that joins the many people on this call, is that without holding the black mirror to our industry, and indeed our big brother, the broader financial markets, we lose probably one of the most potent arguments blasting within the vernacular of impact investing, women and people of color, particularly underrepresented people of color, kind of matching the narrative economics argument of Schiller. I thought I'd put a quote into the thing, because I think that it's not only about making that argument, it's also about thinking about why it's so urgent. And I heard some alarming studies, many on this call are probably familiar with, that I wanted to share. And this is the first of the quotes it's actually in the book Bias by Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, who's our research partner, who co-published this study that I shared earlier in the chat. But I think this is really important to realize that when the police kill unarmed Black suspects, those deaths are associated with a significant dip in the mental health of Blacks, and I would say all people too, but it's disproportionate health of Blacks across the entire state in which they're killed. So what that means and helps me to understand as we struggle with this major macroeconomic issue is that I spent a little time with Michael Lindsay, who many on the call probably know, is that there's a Black suicide rate for Black high school students, age students, and there was a congressional task force launch because it just hit this year. I heard from the new data that Michael Lindsay shared, 134% increase, while there's a decrease in all other groups of the same age group. So when we think about the urgency of impact investing to redefine not only the arguments of the optimal performance that we found were systematically overlooked with Black-led managers within our research relative to white-led managers, we must also look at the way that lack of alpha contributes to the systematic images that left unaddressed within education technology, the systematic biases within things like payday loans that destroy the economic wealth. I spent 3 years passing laws to prevent mortgage lending, predatory lending, and basically putting prepayment penalties in a museum because they were used to overcharge Black and Latinx home buyers, systematically extracting from the number one way in which they achieved the American dream through home ownership. And there are lots of other ways, but at least that's a systematic now illegal taxing of the number one way in which people build wealth in the country. And we all know some of the deep statistics about the wealth gap. So if we don't leave these, including environmental transformations in many of the areas in which we're investing, if we don't think about the ways in which we're pursuing the urgency of this moment and movement to build the fiduciary and intentional solutions that create this new narrative and hold this narrative to the broader financial system like it's empirically proven, as it is in the study that we laid out, combining behavioral economics and social psychology within the argument, demonstrating that people will basically leave money on the table before they'll invest in high-performing Black-led funds, even at the highest level of performance. So part of what we are trying to struggle with is a community problem, a statewide problem, a national problem. It's a problem that isn't necessarily on anyone's platform as they're building towards the election. And indeed, it's a problem that I think our community has a wonderful ability to contribute platform level standards. I know Ryan's comments resonated so deeply with me, as did Marla's, Andrea's, and Erika's, as well as both of yours, and David and Monique's, and trying to really reconcile some of this public equity, some of these public equity challenges, to Ryan's point. And we look at the part of one of the requirements of all, Illumen Capital is impact investing fund of funds. We invest in growth, venture, and PE funds, and we require 10 years of implicit bias reduction training as a condition of our investment, along with a mandatory impact experience, where we draw a through line between slavery, lynching, mass incarceration, and the ways in which that informs and creates an imbalance in the asset management business. Because what we find is that many that are leading endowments and pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, don't have the context to begin to enter the solution set and conversation and begin to reduce bias as it relates to their investment committee processes, their hiring, promotion, retention, and attraction processes, and their board selection practices. So I'll leave it at that, but I'm super excited to be here with all of you, and excited about this moment in time and the ability to work together to hold a mirror to the broader financial system around the incredible work of so many people on this call.
Thank you for that, Daryn. And before we go to sort of a wrap, because obviously we're getting close at the top of the hour, and those who can stay, please do, and those who have to go, we understand. But Daryn, if you can give us just super fast, you've been in all these spaces raising capital to support this fund of funds and this theory of change, essentially, in addition to roaming the world with Dr. Eberhardt and sharing thoughts on the deep work around the bias reduction that you've done in collaboration with the team of academics and others. So, the thinking is rigorous and steeped. What has been just your quick take? How has that landed with those that you are looking to share this information? Because as we know, behavioral economics, as you've said, data doesn't always convince. And the data, in fact, would condemn folks in their position as fiduciaries. So what is the reply, largely from the community of investors that you've been speaking with, and really the field in general? You've been on CNBC and other mainstream finance, legacy finance, in David's parlance, places. So, a quick take on really, how does it land?
Yeah, I'll borrow from, paraphrase James Baldwin, that many people know, but many people find it difficult to act on what they know, because to act is to be in danger. And in danger of what? Losing our own identity, or one's own identity. And it's easy to say that you support this work, but when people get to the check writing process, it becomes, there's more friction and less movement, as is indicated by the 1.3% of $69 trillion in capital managed by women and people of color-led funds, where that number should be normally distributed around $35 trillion to achieve the optimal performance of the industry. So as we look at that difference between kind of intention and action, that's a critically important step. Emerging manager programs started 40 years ago, and we're still at that abysmally low number. So our thesis is something else is going on, and what that is, we believe, is implicit bias. And I thought that I'd just share, just to let you know how long and how serious this problem is. At the last Impact Experience, we had all of our Illumen investors there, or many of them, and Josephine McCall presented. And this is a book, I can throw it in the chat as well. This is a book called The Penalty of Success, which is almost eerily close to the label of the research paper that we published. And this was, her father was lynched in Lawson County, Alabama, for building a successful trucking company, essentially, and built it to 3 semi tractor trailer trucks. White allies helped him get every loan that he got in order to buy those trucks, because no bank would give him a loan in the 50s, and targeted for his outperformance, which I believe has metastasized in real and in significant ways, in creating, bias barriers to Black fund managers and entrepreneurs, over the last several years. And so many within the dominant kind of leadership of Alabama, when, just as a reminder, when integration happened, a lot of the white folks that were in power in Alabama were asked, what do you think now that the now that the signs are down on the whites only and colored only bathrooms? And many said, what signs? Because they weren't, when you're benefiting from a system, the gift of seeing the humanity of other people is often pushed beyond one's reach, because they're benefiting from the system, unless they systematically go about a process to reduce bias. And of course, we can all benefit from reducing bias. Our Black managers and our white managers go through a 10-year process of bias reduction, and but there certainly is a need for those in controlling the reins of the $69 trillion in capital in the country to go through a process to look at the way that bias diminishes the returns and diminishes the humanity of all of us, right? That's the key thing that I would sort of leave with is, John Donne, and any man's death diminishes me. Don't send to know for whom the bell tolls, because it tolls for thee.
Yeah, I want to just add, Daryn, that point to underscore the humanity in this. I think Monique, maybe you said early on, what's the emotion, or someone said, maybe it was David, what's the emotional core of this work? How does it connect? And I think back to, if there's one thing I would, push you on, Andrea, in your work as you evolve that body of research, is connecting that back to this emotional core. As Black folks on this call, I can speak for myself, but I don't know if I can relate to everyone else. You're talking about your work, the history of your people, what your family, kids, loved ones are experiencing, and and there's other communities and other identities that are feeling this as well. But it's a real thing. Our work is who we are, and it's the story of our people and how they've been plundered in this world. So how do you make this, how do you take the investing conversation and keep it grounded in community, in the stories and the voices of people who are experiencing this? I think that's probably the majority of the work. I feel like the data points are just the start. And I think we had there was a Black woman, Keisha Bird, at Center for Law and Social Policy. I know I'm going over, I'll make this real quick. She told us early on with Activest, yes, we're looking at municipal data, looking at risk, but if you don't really ground it in community partners and organizations and folks' lives, you're going to miss the whole point, Ryan. And your team is going to just be contributing data and not real, kind of not change. And you're not linking it back to the communities that are, you know, most impacted. And that's changed the way, that's been our North Star ever since she set me straight. And I appreciate all the Black women who continue to set me straight since then. And so, you know, that's probably one of my biggest takeaways of kind of what I'm hearing, and I appreciate you underscoring that, Daryn, too.
I'll just pop in here, and I think we'll just do a super fast lightning round. Is that right, David, from our speakers here? I think about intersectionality a lot lately, and how I can't divorce my Blackness from my womanness, and other people cannot divorce their sexuality, their abilities, their neurodiversity. And we think about the order of operations for solving. If we solve for the Black woman who is neurodiverse, who has some different ability, we literally solve for everyone. Other countries might have a different person who is the embodiment of all of those different intersecting identities. And someone mentioned in the chat, you know, let's think about elsewhere. We're here in finance, we're here in America, we're talking about the US case, which is certainly racism is the main operating system feature that we have the legacy to, you know, redress. And then other places and other contexts, other countries have a different thing, and their embedded code might be religion or some other marginalized group that is differently identified. But I wanted to just share before everyone disappears a closing quote from Dolores Huerta, and then I think we'll go in the order that we introduced everyone again. We'll start with Andrea, Ryan, Marla, Erika. Lightning round, and to Daryn, lightning round about 30 seconds or so of your just summation thoughts. Every moment is an organizing opportunity. Every person is a potential activist. Every minute, a chance to change the world. We talk about, Marian, you said, it's about people. Organizations are comprised of people. Our countries are comprised of people. Everyone is making decisions. These are not separate from us. They are us. And so what is our responsibility at every level that we show up? And of course, here at the edge of our fingertips is impact investing. And just we are charged to do something here as well as any place else. And so, Andrea, I'll pass the mic to you and we'll go in that order. I won't stop in between and reintroduce everyone, but Andrea, Ryan, Marla, Erika, and then Daryn.
Thanks, Monique. No, and thanks everyone. Well, I feel like I learned a lot from listening to my fellow speakers here. This was an enlightening series of perspectives, and I appreciate Ryan, the point that you're bringing up. It's one that, you know, we struggle with constantly, thinking, look, I'm just an Italian immigrant with a very different experience, happens to work in finance, happens to care about racial justice and social justice issues. What is there that we can do? And part of it is, you know, the analysis, and a big part, I think, that you're pointing to, and I take very much to heart, is this build bridging and connecting, which we very much try to do also through the Institute and through the cohort on worker justice and racial justice, right? Getting folks that are on the activist side, folks that very intentionally, my colleague Midi has been saying, let's see who really wants to have bring the voice into the conversation, but don't even have the tools, the lingo, whatever might be needed. And in some cases, it's not needed. How can we make sure that that we play a role in bringing those voices into a conversation, that we center different voices, different scholarship? But we still have a long way to go with that. So I very much appreciate your bringing it up. Frankly, I would say to everyone, maybe as part of our next steps in this work, not only help us build it in terms of saying, like, yeah, how actually from the investor side some of these things can technically work, or what have we overlooked, but also help break it down, because there are some limitations in there. I'm mindful that the approach might be very academic, very technical. You know, it's but one contribution in this field, and hopefully it does something positive. But if not, like, we don't want to do it if it's not helpful. So I would strongly encourage everyone to just you know, let us know how we can improve it.
Thanks, Andrea, and I appreciate all the work that you're doing, and the research is is very tight. As I kind of was going through it all earlier today. The small thing, I mean, I've already said a lot, but the small thing is I just appreciate the folks out there that are holding us accountable and speaking those things to us that we probably wouldn't admit ourselves. And so thanks, y'all. You know who you are, and keep doing it.
Thank you all for having me. It's been great to be a part of this. And I think the last thought I'd leave folks with is you all are managing performance and evaluating numbers. And you probably already know this old adage, but you get what you inspect, not what you expect. And if you can take a look and then hold people accountable in exactly the way that Ryan was kind of referring to just now, by creating ways to measure this, by creating insights and awareness, by, Andrea's research here has done tremendous work in drawing attention to some of the challenges here. We can change this by just shining a bright light in a lot of places. So let's get to it.
Thank you so much, Monique, for your leadership and for hosting this session. It's been truly a pleasure, and listening to all the brilliance around the table has informed even more of the work that I need to do as well. And so I think that is one of the takeaways, in addition to what Ryan shared about the having the heart for this work. It's learning and relearning because, excuse me, the systems that we have inherited have brought us to this point. And so we really do have to learn to undo what it is and literally question everything in terms of, the results that you see. Why am I seeing what it is that I'm seeing, and what caused that, and really unpacking and being willing to, again, interrogate those things and even the thoughts that we bring into to these processes, because it's all, fruit of the poisonous tree, if you will. So it's a challenge for every single one of us every single day, but it's worthwhile.
And just in terms of final thoughts, the picture behind me is Jacob Lawrence, the library. And its roots are in the 1925 Schomburg Museum, and what the outlet of all people understanding the Black narrative led to, with great hunger, as it had been systematically left out of the narrative of America as a unique and mirror-oriented narrative that could allow people to think, like James Baldwin would later say, that essentially that pain and heartbreak people believe is unprecedented in history, but then they begin to read. So again, I think our fight is a unified fight in which we can truly see each other and open each other's eyes. I believe that the same is true, and that this group here can rewrite the history of asset management to include certainly Black people and people of color, but also the optimality that results, just like it did within the narratives of the country. And it came out of a need for Jacob Lawrence to look in his own books and see himself written out of the history, as so many of us look into the books of the financial and asset management business and see ourselves written out until that changes.
I just want to thank everybody, in particular the speakers, and especially Monique, for just a beautiful job of hosting this. So I see people clapping. That's great, and it reinforces a lesson which some of us can take, which is the best thing to do is just get out of the way sometimes. I also want to just thank all the people who've showed up for the call, and I see there's still 83 folks left, even though we've run about 15 minutes later. We will, as we've done in the past few calls, and some of you have been there, just leave the Zoom chat open, almost no moderation, sometimes a little, flick here and there, but we'll just leave it open so folks can, keep the chat line open, trade trade email, trade contact information, just kind of hang out. And obviously if you want to leave, do so. But it's such a privilege to be able to have these kind of conversations. I mean, this is what Impact Alpha was kind of built for, is to try to bring conversations together, bring maybe folks who don't always talk and share to do so. And on that point, keep it coming. I mean, just if you have thoughts out of this, send them to us. If you have guest posts that you want to share with the Impact Alpha community, send them to us. If we're doing it right, let us know. If we're doing it wrong, let us know. And thanks to all. So, Monique, we're at this point. We sort of just, it's always awkward. People start clicking off, but we also just want to open